The transport ship descended through thick orange clouds, and Lieutenant Mira Vance pressed her face against the small window to watch the jungle moon grow larger beneath her. She had not asked for this assignment, and she certainly had not wanted it, but the coalition military did not care what she wanted anymore. 6 months ago, she had been the rising star of the xenobiology division with 3 published papers and a team of researchers who hung on her every word. Now she was cargo being shipped to the worst posting in the entire fleet. The moon was called Thesser 9, and it was a death world covered in vegetation that wanted to eat you, and creatures that wanted to eat you even more. The coalition had established a small colony here because the moon contained rare minerals needed for faster than light travel. But keeping that colony alive required hunters. Hunters who killed the monsters before the monsters killed everyone else. Myra was not a hunter, and she had never wanted to be one, but Command had decided that her skills were wasted in a laboratory after what they called the incident on Kepler 442b. She called it a breakthrough, but they called it reckless endangerment of military personnel. All she had done was prove that the creatures on that planet were not attacking humans out of aggression, but out of fear. And she had demonstrated that by walking into their nest alone and calming the entire colony with nothing but her voice and her body language. The creatures had stopped attacking after that, and the colony had been saved, but Command had not seen a victory. They had seen a scientist who had disobeyed direct orders and risked her life, and they could not allow that kind of behavior to spread. So they had sent her here to the 77th Hunter Division, where difficult people were sent to be forgotten. The transport landed with a heavy thunk, and Mira gathered her single bag of belongings and walked down the ramp into the humid air of Thesser 9. The smell hit her first, and it was the smell of rotting vegetation and something else underneath it, something alive and watching. A young soldier was waiting for her at the bottom of the ramp, and he looked nervous and tired, and his uniform was stained with mud and something that might have been blood. "Lieutenant Vance?" he asked, and his voice cracked slightly on her name. "That is me," she replied. "I am Private Chun, and I am supposed to bring you to the base, but we need to hurry because the Razorback has been spotted near the northern perimeter again." Myra had read about the Razorback Titan in her briefing materials, and it was the apex predator of this region, standing 12 meters tall, with armored plates covering its body and claws that could tear through military-grade steel. It had already hospitalized 6 hunters this month and killed 2 more. "How far is the base?" Myra asked. "About 3 kilometers through the jungle, but we have a transport vehicle waiting." They climbed into a small armored rover, and Private Chun drove fast through the narrow path that had been cut through the vegetation. As they drove, he told her about the 77th, and every word confirmed what Myra had already suspected. The squad was made up of 12 soldiers, and every single one of them was a failure in the eyes of the coalition. There was Sergeant Okonkwo, who had been the best sniper in her class until she froze during a combat mission and watched 3 of her squad mates die because she could not pull the trigger. There was Corporal Reyes, who had been a demolitions expert until he miscalculated an explosive charge and destroyed half an allied outpost along with his own confidence. There was Private Chun himself, who had been a combat medic until he refused to let wounded enemy creatures suffer and had been caught giving pain relief to a dying alien predator instead of letting it die slowly as Command had ordered. "We are called the Dregs," Chun said. And there was no bitterness in his voice, just acceptance. "Nobody expects anything from us anymore. And honestly, most of us have stopped expecting anything from ourselves." Mira listened and said nothing, but her mind was already working. These were not bad soldiers, she realized. These were soldiers whose compassion and caution had been labeled as weakness by a military that only valued aggression before she could respond. The radio crackled to life, and a panicked voice filled the rover. "This is Sergeant Okonkwo, and we are pinned down at grid reference 774, and the Razorback has us surrounded, and we need immediate evac." Chun swore and yanked the steering wheel hard to the left, sending the rover bouncing off the main path and into the dense jungle. "We are 10 minutes out," he said into the radio. "Hold your position." "We cannot hold for 10 minutes," Okonkwo shouted back, and Mira could hear plasma fire in the background and the deep rumbling roar of something enormous. "It is right on top of us." Myra made a decision in that moment, and she did not stop to think about whether it was wise or foolish. "Drive faster," she said, "and when we get there, do not fire unless I tell you to." Chun looked at her like she had lost her mind, but he pressed the accelerator down harder. They burst into a clearing 8 minutes later, and Mira saw the situation immediately. 5 soldiers were huddled behind a fallen tree that provided almost no cover, and the Razorback Titan was circling them with the patient hunger of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to go. It was even larger than the reports had suggested, and its scales were a deep crimson color that caught the orange light filtering through the canopy. And its eyes were intelligent and angry. The soldiers were firing plasma bolts at it, but the shots bounced off its armored hide like raindrops, and each shot only made the creature angrier. Myra opened the rover door and stepped out. "Lieutenant, what are you doing?" Chun screamed at her. She did not answer, and she did not look back. Instead, she walked calmly into the clearing, and she made herself small, and she lowered her eyes, and she breathed slowly and deeply. The Razorback noticed her immediately, and its massive head swung toward this new threat, and it roared so loud that Mira felt it in her chest. She knelt in the mud, and she did not run, and she did not fight. She listened. The creature charged toward her, and the ground shook. With each step, and behind her she heard Chun screaming, and the soldiers crying out in terror. But Mira did not move, and she kept her eyes lowered and her body relaxed, and she made a sound in the back of her throat that was not quite human. It was a sound she had learned from years of studying predators across a dozen worlds, and it was a sound that meant, "I am not a threat, and I am not prey, and I am something else entirely." The Razorback stopped 3 meters away from her, and its hot breath washed over her face, and its claws dug into the mud, and then slowly, impossibly, it lowered its head. Myra reached up and placed her palm against its snout, and the creature that had terrorized this moon for months closed its eyes and made a sound, almost like a purr. Behind her, the soldiers of the 77th stared in absolute silence, and Private Chun dropped his weapon in the mud. Mira Vance had just introduced herself to her new home, and she had done it in the only language that truly mattered, the language of understanding. The base camp of the 77th Hunter Division was a collection of battered prefab buildings surrounded by a fence that had been repaired so many times it looked more like a patchwork quilt than a defensive barrier. Myra walked through the gate with the Razorback Titan following behind her like an enormous dog, and every soldier in the camp stopped what they were doing to stare. Some of them reached for their weapons, but a sharp command from Sergeant Okonkwo stopped them. "Hold your fire," Okonkwo shouted. "That is an order." The sergeant was a tall woman with close-cropped gray hair and scars running down the left side of her face, and she looked at Mira with an expression that was equal parts fear and fascination. "Lieutenant Vance," she said slowly, "would you care to explain what in the name of all that is holy is happening right now?" Mira turned to look at the Razorback, which had settled onto its haunches just outside the gate, and was watching the humans with calm, curious eyes. "It is not going to hurt anyone," Myra said. "It was never trying to hurt anyone, and it was trying to protect its territory because we kept invading it with weapons and aggression." "It killed 2 of our people," said a voice from the crowd, and Mira turned to see a stocky man with burned scars on his hands stepping forward. This would be Corporal Reyes. She guessed, the demolitions expert who had lost his confidence along with his eyebrows. "It killed 2 people who were trying to kill it first," Myra replied. And her voice was not cruel, but it was firm. What would you do if someone came into your home with weapons and started shooting? Reyes opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out, and after a moment he looked away. Myra turned back to the assembled squad, and she saw what she had expected to see: 12 soldiers who had been broken by a system that did not value what they had to offer and who had stopped believing they had anything to offer at all. "I read all of your files on the transport," she said, "and I know why each of you is here, and I know what the Coalition thinks of you." Nobody spoke, but she could see them tensing and waiting for the same judgments they had heard 100 times before. "The Coalition thinks you are failures," Mira continued. "They think Private Chun is too soft because he showed mercy to a dying creature, and they think Sergeant Okonkwo is a coward because she hesitated before taking a life, and they think Corporal Reyes is incompetent because he made one mistake under pressure." She paused and looked at each of them in turn. "I think the Coalition is wrong, and I think every single trait that got you sent here is exactly what makes you valuable." For a long moment nobody moved, and then Private Chun stepped forward with a confused expression on his young face. "What do you mean, Lieutenant?" Mira smiled, and it was the first real smile she had worn in months. "I mean that I am going to teach you a different way to be hunters. Over the next 3 days, Myra turned everything the 77th thought they knew upside down. She started with Chun because his instincts were already closest to what she needed. "You gave pain relief to a dying predator," she said as they walked along the perimeter fence, with the Razorback trailing behind them like a scaly shadow. "Why?" Chun looked uncomfortable, and he kept glancing at the massive creature as if expecting it to attack at any moment. "Because it was suffering," he said finally, "and I could not just watch it suffer when I had the ability to help." "That is empathy," Myra said. "That is the ability to understand what another creature is feeling, and that is the most important skill a hunter can have." Chun stared at her, and she could see him trying to reconcile her words with everything he had been taught. "The military says empathy is weakness," he said. "The military is wrong," Mira replied. "Empathy is information, and when you can understand what a creature is feeling, you can predict what it is going to do, and that gives you power that no weapon can match." She taught him to read the micro-expressions of alien creatures and to recognize the difference between aggression and fear, and between territorial warnings and genuine threats. She taught him that a creature baring its teeth might be saying, "Stay away from my family," rather than, "I want to eat you," and that the correct response to those two situations was completely different. With Sergeant Okonkwo, she took a different approach. "You froze during that mission," Myra said, and they were sitting on a rocky outcrop overlooking a valley filled with strange purple vegetation. "Tell me what you were thinking in that moment." Okonkwo was silent for a long time, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was thinking that we were wrong, and the creatures we were hunting, and they were not attacking the colony, and they were running away from something else, and I could see it in the way they moved, and I hesitated, because I was not sure we should be killing them." "Were you right?" Another long silence, and then Okonkwo nodded. The after-action report confirmed that there was a seismic event in the area, and the creatures were fleeing, not attacking. "And if I had fired, I would have killed innocent animals for nothing." "So you did not freeze because you were a coward," Mira said gently. "You froze because your instincts were telling you something was wrong, and your instincts were correct." She taught Okonkwo to trust those instincts again, and to understand that stillness was not cowardice, but rather a predator behavior, and that the most dangerous hunters in the universe were the ones who knew when not to strike. With Reyes, she worked on control. "Sound is a weapon," she told him as they stood in a clearing with audio equipment spread out around them. "But it does not have to be a destructive weapon." She showed him how certain frequencies could calm agitated creatures, and how rhythmic vibrations could communicate safety and peace, and how the same skills that let him calculate explosive yields could be used to calculate the precise tones needed to soothe a frightened animal. By the end of the second day, race had stopped a charging pack of smaller predators in their tracks, using nothing but a handheld speaker and the right combination of sounds. By the third day, the 77th had not fired a single shot, but they had cleared more territory than any hunter squad in the sector. Word began to spread through the coalition fleet. At first, it was just rumors and soldiers from other units laughing about the crazy scientist who thought she could talk to monsters. But then the reports started coming in, and the numbers did not lie. The 77th was completing missions faster with fewer casualties and lower equipment costs than any other hunter division on Lesser 9, and they were doing it without killing anything. Alien observers from the Corvani Dominion had been watching humanity since first contact, and they had built their entire assessment of the human species on one simple observation: humans fought nature because they had forgotten how to speak to it now. They watched through long-range sensors as a human woman walked through the jungle with a razorback titan at her side and a squad of soldiers who moved like they belonged there. And, for the first time in centuries, the Corvani felt something they had almost forgotten. They felt afraid. Mira was in the middle of a training session with her squad when the first tremors hit, and the coffee in her mug sloshed over the rim, and the walls of the prefab building groaned. "Earthquake?" asked Chun, and there was fear in his voice. Myra shook her head slowly, and she could feel something else beneath the vibrations, and something that was not geological. "Something is moving," she said. "Something big." The alarm sirens started wailing 30 seconds later, and a panicked voice came over the base intercom: "All personnel to defensive positions, and we have a Harbinger emergence event in progress. And this is not a drill, and repeat, this is not a drill." The color drained from every face in the room, and Myra understood why she had read about the Harbingers in her briefing materials, and they were the closest thing to a nightmare that Lesser 9 had produced. They were insectoid creatures, ranging in size from a human fist to a small vehicle, and they lived in vast underground hive networks. And when they emerged, they did so in numbers that blocked out the soon. A single Harbinger was not particularly dangerous, but there were never single Harbingers, and there were only swarms, and those swarms had consumed entire outposts in hours, leaving nothing behind but bones and silence. The standard military response to a Harbinger emergence was orbital bombardment because nothing else worked. Mira ran outside with her squad, and what she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The jungle to the north was moving, and at first her brain could not process what she was seeing, and then she understood it was not the jungle that was moving, and it was the coast. Her brain could not process what she was tasting. And then she understood it was not the jungle that was moving, and it was the Harbingers, millions of them, maybe billions, and they were pouring out of the ground like water from a broken dam, and they were flowing across the landscape in a living river of chitin and mandibles. The base defense guns opened fire, and plasma bolts tore through the leading edge of the swarm, and hundreds of creatures died in each blast, but it did not matter because there were always more. Admiral Chun's voice crackled over the emergency channel, and he was the commander of the fleet in orbit. Above them, all ground personnel prepare for immediate evacuation, and orbital strike package is being prepared, and you have 15 minutes to reach the extraction point. Myra grabbed the radio from the communications officer. "Admiral, this is Lieutenant Vance, and I am requesting that you hold the orbital strike." There was a pause, and when the Admiral spoke again, his voice was cold. "Lieutenant, you do not have the authority to make that request, and the Harbingers represent an extinction level threat, and orbital bombardment is the only effective response." "They are not attacking," Myra said, and she was watching the swarm with an intensity that made her eyes hurt. "Look at their movement patterns, and they are not converging on the base, and they are moving around us. Lieutenant Vance, you have 10 minutes to reach the extraction point, and if you are not there, we are leaving without you." The channel went dead, and Mira lowered the radio. Her squad was staring at her, and she could see the fear in their eyes, and she could see something else too. and it was trust. "Lieutenant," Sergeant Okonkwo said slowly, "what are you thinking?" Mira watched the swarm for another moment, and she saw what she had hoped to see. Harbingers were not hunting, and they were not attacking, and they were fleeing. Something had scared them out of their tunnels, and they were running, and the only thing in their path was the human colony to the south. If the orbital strike hit them here, it would kill billions of creatures, and would also destroy the base and potentially trigger secondary seismic events that could make this entire region unstable. But if the Harbingers kept moving in their current direction, they would run straight through 3 colonial settlements before reaching the southern continent. Thousands of humans would die unless someone could convince the swarm to change course. "Stay here," Myra said, and she started walking toward the northern fence. Lieutenant Chun called after her, "What are you doing?" She did not answer because she did not have time to explain. The Razorback Titan appeared beside her as she reached the fence, and it made a low, rumbling sound in its chest that she had learned to recognize as concern. "I know," she said softly, and she placed her hand on its massive leg. "But I have to try." She climbed over the fence and walked toward the swarm. The leading edge of the Harbinger mass was 300 meters away and closing fast and up close. They were even more terrifying than she had imagined. Their bodies were segmented and covered in sharp spines, and their mandibles clicked constantly, creating a sound like a billion tiny drums. Mira stopped walking, and she knelt in the dirt as she closed her eyes. She had never tried to communicate with a hive mind before, and she was not even sure it was possible. But she knew that the Harbingers were not mindless. They had built vast underground cities, and they had survived for millions of years on this hostile world, and nothing survived that long without intelligence. She focused on her breathing, and she slowed her heartbeat, and she thought about what the swarm might be feeling: fear, and that was the dominant emotion, and they were terrified. Something had happened in their tunnels, and something catastrophic, and they were running for their lives. Mira opened her eyes, and she saw that the leading edge of the swarm had stopped 10 meters away from her. The creatures were piling up behind each other and creating a living wall of bodies, and they were watching her. She reached into her pack and pulled out the pheromone synthesizer that she had been modifying all week. And it was a small device originally designed to repel insects, but she had been tweaking the chemical output based on samples she had collected from the local fauna. She activated the device and adjusted the output to something she hoped would communicate peaceful intentions. The swarm shuddered, and the clicking of mandibles changed pitch, and she had their attention. Now she needed to talk to them. She began tapping her fingers against the ground in a rhythmic pattern, and it was a pattern she had observed the creatures using in their underground tunnels, and it meant location and direction and safety. The swarm responded, and the creatures nearest to her began tapping back, and it was not language exactly, and it was something older and more fundamental. Over the next hour, Mira conducted the strangest negotiation of her life. She learned that the Harbingers had been flooded out of their breeding chambers by an underground river that had shifted course, and she learned that they needed to reach the thermal vents on the southern continent to save their young, and she learned that they had no interest in humans at all. They simply needed to pass through, and she learned something else, and something that changed everything. The Harbingers had a proposal: if the humans would guide them safely around the colonial settlements, and if the humans would show them that not all surface dwellers were threats, then the Harbingers would remember, and any human wearing the markings of those who helped them would be allowed to pass through Harbinger territory forever. Myra accepted the proposal. She walked back to the base, and she told Admiral Chun to hold the orbital strike, and she told him that she was going to lead the swarm around the colonies personally. Thought she was insane, but the alien observers were watching, and he could not afford to be seen ordering the death of a coalition officer on an open channel, so he watched from orbit as Lieutenant Mira Vance walked into a river of claws and mandibles, and as the swarm parted around her like water around a stone, and as she led billions of creatures on a 3-day march around every human settlement on their path. By the time the harbingers reached the southern continent, every member of the 77th had walked among them, and every member of the 77th now carried the chemical signature that marked them as protected humanity. Had just signed its first treaty with the hive mind, and the galaxy would never be the same. The Galactic Council Chamber was a vast circular room carved from living crystal, and it sat at the heart of the oldest space station in known space. 12 species had seats on the council, and each one represented civilizations that had conquered the stars while humanity was still learning to make fire. The Corvani Dominion had been watching the younger races for 10,000 years, and their ambassador was a tall being with pale blue skin and bioluminescent patterns that shifted with his emotions. Right now, those patterns were flickering rapidly, and that meant he was afraid. "We have a problem," he said, and his voice echoed through the crystal chamber. The other ambassadors turned to look at him, and they were beings of every shape and size, and some breathed oxygen, and some breathed methane, and some did not breathe at all. But they all shared one thing in common, and that was their concern about humanity. "The humans again," said the Thulakari delegate, and she was a small creature, covered in golden fur with 6 arms and eyes that saw in spectrums no human could imagine. "What have they done now?" The Corvani ambassador activated the holographic display in the center of the chamber, and an image appeared. It showed a human woman walking through a jungle with a massive armored predator at her side and a swarm of insects flowing around her feet like a living carpet. "This is Lieutenant Mira Vance of the Human Coalition Military," the Corvani said. "1 week ago, she was assigned to a failed combat unit on the moon designated Desert 9. He changed the image to show the same woman kneeling before the Razorback Titan, and then to show her negotiating with the Harbinger Swarm, and then to show her walking among creatures that should have torn her apart. In 7 days, she has done what our civilizations deemed impossible, and she has formed alliances with apex predators, and she has brokered peace with a hive mind, and she has turned every dangerous creature on that moon into a potential ally." The chamber erupted in noise in a dozen alien languages overlapping in shock and disbelief. The Thulakari delegate raised 3 of her arms for silence. "One human," she said slowly. "One human with no special equipment and no military support, and she has accomplished this." "Yes. How?" The Corvani ambassador's bioluminescent patterns shifted to a deep purple, and that color meant shame. "We do not know exactly, and our scientists have been studying human psychology since first contact, and we believed we understood them, and we were wrong." He pulled up another display, and this one showed data from human history and images of ancient humans living alongside wolves and horses and elephants. The humans evolved on a world filled with apex predators, and for millions of years they were prey and not hunters, and they survived not through strength, but through something else entirely. "What?" asked the delegate from the crystalline Lorathi collective. "Communication," the Corvani said. "The humans developed an instinctive ability to read the body, language, and emotional states of other species, and they learned to make themselves understood across species boundaries, and they domesticated predators and turned enemies into allies." He paused and let that sink in. "We always assumed that humans were dangerous because they were violent and aggressive, and we were partially correct, but we missed the larger threat." "Which is?" the Thulakari asked. "They are dangerous because they can make friends with anything." The chamber fell silent, and the implications hung in the air like poison gas. For 10,000 years, the older civilizations had maintained their power through military might and technological superiority, and they had built their empires by conquering or exterminating the dangerous fauna on every world they colonized. The idea that someone might choose to ally with those creatures instead of destroying them had simply never occurred to them. Consider the strategic implications. The Corvani continued. If humanity can form alliances with apex predators, then they do not need to build the largest fleet, and they do not need to develop the deadliest weapons, and they simply need to ask the monsters of 1,000 worlds to fight beside them. That is absurd, said a delegate from the insectoid. Crixel Empire. No species would follow humans into battle, and the creatures are animals. The Harbinger Swarm. Ondesser 9 has designated every member of Lieutenant Vance's squad as protected. The Kovani replied, if those humans are threatened, the swarm will respond, and that is not an alliance of convenience, and that is loyalty. The Crixel delegate fell silent, and his compound eyes reflected the holographic display with its images of a human woman surrounded by creatures that should have killed her. There is more, the Kovani said. Since Lieutenant Vance began her work, 3 other apex species on Ondesser 9 have begun following her unit, and they do not follow them as prey, and they follow them as pack members. He changed the display one more time, and it showed a map of the galaxy with human-controlled space highlighted in blue. The humans are expanding, and every world they colonize has its own apex predators and its own dangerous fauna, and if they apply Lieutenant Vance's methods on a galactic scale, he did not need to finish the sentence, and every delegate understood. Within a generation, humanity could have allies on every inhabited world, and those allies would be the most dangerous creatures each planet had to offer. No fleet could fight that, and no army could conquer it. What do you propose? The Thelakari delegate asked, and her voice was very quiet. The Kurvani ambassador's pattern shifted to a cold white, and that color meant determination. Lieutenant Vance must be stopped, and her methods must be suppressed, and the humans must never be allowed to realize what they are capable of. You are proposing assassination, the Thelakari said. I am proposing survival, and if we allow this to continue, then, within a century, humanity will be the dominant force in the galaxy, and not through conquest, and not through war, but through something far more dangerous. Through friendship. The word hung in the air, and it sounded almost ridiculous, but no one laughed. The council voted, and it was unanimous. The Kovani would send their best assassins, and the Thelakari would provide neural disruptor technology, and the other species would pressure the human coalition through diplomatic channels. Lieutenant Mira Vance would be removed from her position one way or another. The humans would be taught that there were limits to what the galaxy would tolerate, and the monsters of 1,000 worlds would remain what they had always been. Enemies to be destroyed and never allies to be trusted. At least that was the plan, but plans have a way of failing when they underestimate their targets, and the Galactic Council had made the same mistake that every enemy of humanity had made since the dawn of time. They had forgotten that humans did not fight alone. The assassins arrived on Ondesser 9 3 days after the Galactic Council made its decision. There were 3 Corvani operatives, and each one had been killing for longer than human civilization had existed, and they moved through the jungle like ghosts, and leaving no trace and making no sound. With them was a Thelakari neural disruption team and 4 specialists carrying equipment that could shut down a human brain from 50 meters away. They had studied their target carefully, and they knew that Lieutenant Vance was dangerous in her own way, but she was still just one human with no combat training and no special abilities. This would be simple. The coalition had already been pressured through diplomatic channels, and Mira's commanding officers had received orders to transfer the 77th to a supply depot on the far side of the moon, and to schedule Lieutenant Vance for a psychological evaluation that would end her career. Official story would be that she had suffered a breakdown from stress, and that her claims about communicating with alien predators were delusions, and that the 77's success had been exaggerated in the reports. The assassins were just insurance in case the official story was not enough. They reached the depot at midnight, and the jungle around them was silent, and the only light came from the distant stars and the faint glow of the depot's emergency lighting. The lead Corvani operative signaled for his team to spread out and they had thermal imaging. And they had motion sensors, and they had every advantage that 10,000 years of military technology could provide. They found nothing. The depot was empty, and the buildings were dark, and there was no sign of the 77th anywhere. They knew we were coming. The Thulakari team leader whispered, and her voice was tight with confusion. How could they know? The Kovani operative did not answer because he was staring at something in the darkness too. Eyes were watching him from the edge of the jungle. And they were large eyes, and they reflected the starlight like mirrors. And they were not human eyes. He raised his weapon, but before he could fire, something moved behind him, and he felt hot breath on the back of his neck. He turned slowly, and the Razorback Titan was standing 3 meters away, and it was watching him with the patient attention of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to run. I would not move if I were you. The voice came from the jungle, and a moment later Mira Vance stepped into the clearing. She was not alone, Sergeant. Okonkwo emerged from the shadows to her left, and Private Chun appeared on her right, and Corporal Rias and the rest of the 77th materialized from hiding spots that the Kovani sensors had somehow missed, and behind them and around them and above them in the trees. The monsters, the Razorback Titan, was only the beginning, and there were shadow stalkers in the branches, and their dark fur made them nearly invisible until they moved, and there were Harbinger scouts on the ground, and their mandibles clicked softly in the darkness, and there were creatures that the assassins did not even have names. For every apex predator on Desert-9 had come to this place tonight, and they were all watching. The Kovani. You made a mistake, Myra said, and her voice was calm and almost gentle. You thought that because I was alone and because my squad was considered failures, and you thought we would be easy targets. She walked closer, and the Razorback Titan moved with her, and it made a low rumbling sound in its chest. But we are not alone, and we have never been alone. And that is what your council failed to understand. The lead Kovani operative looked around at the ring of predators surrounding his team, and for the first time in his very long life, he felt true fear. How did you know we were coming? He asked. The Shadow Stalkers told me, Myra replied. They caught unfamiliar scents at the perimeter 2 days ago, and they warned me. The operative stared at her, and his bioluminescent patterns were flickering wildly. You expect me to believe that these animals warned you? They are not animals, Myra said. They are intelligent beings, and they have their own societies and their own cultures, and their own ways of understanding the world. And just because you never bothered to learn their language does not mean they do not have one. She stopped a few meters away from the Kovani, and she looked up at him with eyes that held no hatred and no anger, and only a kind of tired sadness. Your people have been watching humanity since we first reached the stars, and you have been afraid of us the whole time, and you built policies to contain us and restrictions to limit us, and now you send assassins to kill me. She shook her head slowly. You spent 10,000 years teaching the galaxy that monsters are to be feared and destroyed, and you believed that was the only way, and you believed that predators and prey could never coexist. She reached up and placed her hand on the Razorback's massive leg, and the creature lowered its head and pressed its snout against her shoulder. Humans spent 10,000 years learning a different lesson, and we learned that the wolf could become the dog, and we learned that the wild horse could become a partner, and we learned that understanding is stronger than fear. The Thulakari team leader raised her neural disruptor, and her hands were shaking. Stand down, Lieutenant, and you are surrounded. And you cannot win this. Myra smiled, and it was a sad smile. Look around you and tell me who is surrounded. The Thulakari looked, and she saw the Harbinger scouts moving closer, and she saw the Shadow Stalkers descending from the trees, and she saw a dozen species of apex predator forming a circle around her team. If you kill me, Myra said quietly, if you kill any member of my squad, and every creature on this moon will remember, and they will remember the chemical signatures of your species, and they will remember your scent and your movement patterns, and they will teach their children to remember. She paused and let that sink in. And humans have very long memories, and we will make sure that every creature on every world we colonize knows what you did here tonight. The lead Kovani operative lowered his weapon slowly, and he understood what she was saying, and he understood that this was not a threat. It was a promise. What do you want? He asked. I want you to go back to your council, and I want you to tell them what you saw here, and I want you to tell them that humanity is not going to stop. Mira stepped forward, and the Razorback moved with her, and the assassins backed away. We are not your enemies, and we never wanted to be. But we will not be contained, and we will not be limited, and we will not pretend that we are less than we are. She looked up at the stars, and somewhere, up there, the Galactic Council was waiting for a report that would never say what they wanted it to say. The universe is full of dangerous things, and your people learned to fight those dangers, and you learned to destroy them, and you survived, but you never thrived. She turned back to the Corvani, and her eyes were bright with something that might have been hope. Humanity learned a different way, and we learned to make friends with the dangerous things, and we learned that understanding is the greatest weapon, and we did not just survive. We found family everywhere we went. The assassins left that night, and they left without completing their mission, and they left with a story that would shake the foundations of the Galactic Council. And on a jungle moon called Desert 9, a woman stood surrounded by monsters who had chosen to follow her, not because she was the strongest, and not because she was the most dangerous, but because she was the first being in 10,000 years who had bothered to listen. Within a year, the 77th was renamed the First Contact Communion Corps, and within 5 years, humanity had allied apex fauna on 37 worlds, and within a decade, the species that other civilizations had spent eons fearing now answered to human handlers who understood the oldest truth in the universe: you do not survive by being the biggest predator. You survive by being the one the predators trust. And somewhere on Desert 9, an aging Razorback Titan still walked beside an old woman with kind eyes. The first human who had ever spoken its language. The first human who had ever called it friend. The first human who had changed everything, not with weapons, not with war, but with the simple revolutionary act of understanding.